Hello, I'm Dr. David Johnson, Professor of Medicine and Chief of Gastroenterology at Eastern Virginia Medical School. Well, colonoscopy requires preparations, and our preparations don't typically always result in the best preparations, and adequacy is certainly what drives the utilization, what drives the patients to come back on a sooner basis, and again, things that we can always improve. Dr. Doug Rex and one of my colleagues, Dr. Edward Oldfield, and I put together a very recent best practice tips from the experts, if you will, on colon preps and how do we optimize success. Let me give you some of the highlights, and I think you'll find these quite helpful. We do know that overall the preps that we see, at least by the U.S. Multi-Site Task Force, account for adequacy in only about 75 to 80% of the time. So we can do better. Certainly the ways that we can do this are by tailoring the preparations and using strategies to optimize success. We review in this brief discussion the high volume, large volume, and the lower volume preps. Is certainly the latter seem to be the most popular. Certainly patients seem to tolerate these better. We highlight briefly the issues always important on safety, particularly in a couple of these preps. Things to remember: one is the magnesium component, magnesium content of the sodium picosulfate. This is Clinpic. Should be avoided in patients with advanced kidney disease, in this case with the GFRs less than 30, and this would correspond to chronic renal disease stage 4 or 5, so avoid it in those patients. A couple in patients that have G6PD deficiency, certainly in movie prep and Plenview. These are agents that particularly contain ascorbic acid, and they may be subject risk for hemolytic reaction related to the G6PD deficiency. Also, Plenview also has a component of phenylalanine. It's a component of the aspartame ingredient, so avoided in patients with phenylketonuria. There are certain populations where we typically use a larger volume prep because it's more osmotically balanced and not so hyperosmotic. But we, in this review, cite that our experience has been generally they are very safe in the majority of patients. Certainly use some clinical judgments relates to patients with chronic renal disease, congestive heart failure, and decompensated cirrhosis. Elderly and frail patients, those patients, again, we need to look at why are we doing these procedures, but certainly the formulations, be it a tablet or a liquid, need to be adjusted to the individual circumstance. How do we optimize success? There are a couple things to optimize bowel prep efficacy, certainly to recognize things that may predict for less adequate outcomes, particularly insurance barriers. You don't get to pick the prep that you'd ideally like for the individual patient, language barriers, low educational or health literacy type things. There are navigation tools to look at sites of some of these commercial products that could be downloaded to your website and may be quite helpful, in particular applying this to your patients. Bariatric surgery, we always use a low volume prep and extend the time for consumption. Recognize that GI surgeries of any kind in and of themselves are predictors of less adequate preps, but be very careful in the bariatric patient, again, extending the time for consumption. One of the things that we find in particular is the lower volume preps, patients tend to not drink fluids around that. Doug and I really routinely recommend about 2.5 to 3 liters of fluid around the bowel prep, irrespective of what you're taking, and this balances to replenish the effluent losses incurred by the bowel preparation in and of itself. The other issue is the timing of the preparations. The day before is really something that I've routinely moved my dosing much earlier in the afternoon if the patients can begin it that way. Traditionally, patients will see instructions take at 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock when they get home. If they work, if that's the case, they have to do that, but it tends to drive them into effluent bowel movements through the night, and that is very disruptive for sleep, and obviously that may downplay their overall perspective of how the bowel prep went. Remember, the patients don't remember the procedure, but they remember the prep. So moving that dosing into the earlier afternoon or earlier evening, basically to debulk some of the solid stool. The dosing on the morning of is the most important, and this is really to allow a runaway time. That's the time from when they finish the prep to when they get their colonoscopy, generally about 3 hours. So they have to begin their prep generally 4 to 6 hours before they're ready to come in, and then certainly complete it within 2 hours to provide the standards for the ASA criteria for sedation. So again, look at that timing on the day before. The other is a low fiber diet. Traditionally, some patients are routinely put on 2 to 5 days of low fiber diet. It virtually never works. The compliance after 2 days is virtually zero. Routine use of low residue diet has become our standard in patients that don't have predictors for poor outcomes. There is demonstrable evidence the odds ratios are two plus times greater as far as less nausea, vomiting, hunger, higher ease of completion, and willingness to repeat. Those are all important factors in the patient's overall satisfaction. And so we do this morning of the start of the prep and perhaps even for lunch, and then conversion to clear liquids at that point. A couple of things that we routinely look for are use of online or discount pharmacy coupons. Many of the companies are providing these and may allow you access to some of these preps that you would otherwise have thought would be too expensive for individual patients. We conclude with some best practice recommendations, and let me give you those highlights. One is the evaluation of a bowel prep should be tailored to an individual patient, not routine one size fits all. The provider should know the characteristics both of what these bowel preps involve, the fluids around them, and the safety characteristics. We've put together two very valuable tables that I think you'll find something worthwhile downloading, putting up in your schedulers, offices, nurses, and also perhaps on your laptop or tablet that look at the variants, the components of these bowel preps, both FDA and non-FDA approved, and the safety characteristics. So two important tables I think you'll find very helpful. We talked about the volume, and the volume of the bowel prep is in an overall volume of fluids consumed. Remember that 2.5 to 3 liters to provide the adequate hydration status when these patients come in. We talked about the split dosing. The day before dosing, again, can be moved back and certainly, again, make it more flexible. I think the patients will provide this feedback that they slept better and they enjoyed their overall experience much better than if they'd been up all night running to the bathroom. And that day, the day of the prep would stay the same 4 to 6 hours before the scheduled time. Look at the low residue diet. I think this really has become my standard, and certainly the patient's experience is much better, certainly for breakfast in patients that don't have other predictors for poor outcome and less optimal adequacy for their bowel clearance. Remember these online discount coupons, and again, these are things that are particularly relevant for the low volume preps that are currently available. So these characteristics hopefully will give you the same tips that will provide you better discussions or selection of your outcomes for when you do your bowel prep preparations. Dr. David Johnson, thanks again for listening.